I was loading the dishwasher after Sunday dinner when my phone buzzed on the counter. I almost didn't check it. My hands were wet, the soap was dripping, and I figured it was just my brother sending another meme. But something made me reach for it anyway. The text was from my mother. "We've decided to move forward. Booked flights to Costa Rica. Your father and I are taking what we need from the joint account. Don't worry about us, we'll be fine, love you." I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone face down on the counter, dried my hands slowly on the dish towel, and started laughing. Not because it was funny. Because I had closed that account 4 days ago. I should explain who we are, because we are not a dramatic family. Or we weren't, before all of this. My name is Rowan. I'm 31. I work as a paralegal at a small firm in Ottawa, which means I spend a lot of time reading documents that other people sign without reading, and then watching those people be very surprised by the consequences. It's the kind of job that either makes you paranoid or extremely careful. It made me careful. My younger brother, who I'll call by the name he's gone by since childhood. Everyone calls him Cricket. Long story, is 28 and works in landscaping. He and I are close in the way that siblings get close when they spend years quietly protecting each other from the same household. We don't have to explain much to each other. We just know. Our parents, I'll call them what I always called them, Mom and Dad, are in their early 60s. My father spent 20 years working for a telecom company and took an early retirement package about 3 years ago. My mother did bookkeeping for a dental office until she didn't anymore. She resigned during the pandemic and never went back. For most of my childhood they were fine. Not warm, exactly, but functional. There was food, and school and Christmas presents and the occasional summer drive to Sandbanks. The problems started when they retired, or maybe the problems were always there, and retirement just removed everything that had been papering over them. My grandmother, my father's mother, who I have called Gran my entire life and who is 81 years old and still sharp as a tack, owns a small property just outside of Perth, Ontario. It's not grand. It's about 40 acres, mostly woodlot, with a century farmhouse that needs constant attention and a sugar bush that she and my grandfather built together before he passed. After my grandfather died, Gran set up a family trust. The trust was meant to cover the cost of maintaining the property, her care expenses as she got older, and eventually to pass the land to my brother and me. My parents were named as co-trustees, because at the time, that seemed like the sensible thing to do. It was not the sensible thing to do. I didn't realize how bad it had gotten until Gran called me on a Tuesday afternoon last February. She said she'd been trying to get the furnace looked at for 3 weeks, and every time she asked my parents about the maintenance fund, my mother said she'd look into it. Gran is not a woman who complains. When Gran calls to tell you something is wrong, something is very wrong. I drove out to Perth that weekend. The farmhouse was colder than it should have been. Gran had an electric space heater running in the kitchen, which she said she'd been using for 2 weeks. When I sat down with her and asked her to walk me through what she knew about the trust, she handed me a folder she'd kept in the drawer under her bedside table. Bank statements, a few transaction records, some notes she'd made in her careful, looping handwriting. I sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours going through it. The numbers didn't add up. Not even close. The trust had been set up with just over $200,000, along with income from a small timber sale my grandfather had arranged years before he died. There should have been enough to cover property taxes, routine maintenance, and Gran's personal expenses for at least another decade. Instead, the balance had been quietly bleeding out for 18 months. Withdrawals that didn't correspond to any invoice Gran could identify. Transfers to an account that wasn't the property maintenance fund. When I looked up from the folder, Gran was watching me from across the table with the expression of someone who has already figured out what I was about to say, but needed to hear someone else say it. "How much is left?" he asked. I told her. She nodded slowly and looked out the window at the sugar bush. "Your father always did love the idea of being somewhere warm," she said. "He's been talking about Costa Rica since Christmas." I drove back to Ottawa that night, feeling the kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. I didn't say anything to my parents right away. This is important, because it's the part that people ask about most. Why didn't you confront them immediately? Why didn't you call the police? Why did you wait? And the answer is that I'm a paralegal. I know what evidence is. I know what happens when you tip people off before you have what you need. I know that a conversation is not a resolution, it's just a warning. Instead, I called a lawyer. Not someone from my firm, someone I trusted, a woman named Ms. Weatherby who specializes in estate litigation, and who has a very calming voice that somehow makes terrible news easier to absorb. I explained the situation. She told me what we were dealing with, what the legal exposure looked like, and what I needed to do in the next 2 to 3 weeks if I wanted to protect Gran and the property. The first thing was to get Gran to remove my parents as co-trustees. Ms. Weatherby drafted the paperwork. Gran signed it on a Thursday. My parents didn't know. The second thing was to get the trust accounts transferred to an account that my parents had no access to. This took a few days to arrange, but it was done. Whatever was left, and it was significantly less than it should have been, was now somewhere my parents couldn't reach. The third thing was to document everything. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every discrepancy. I spent 3 evenings at Gran's kitchen table building a file that I then handed to Ms. Weatherby. I didn't tell Cricket right away either, which he later gave me grief about, though I think he understood why. I needed to be sure before I pulled my brother into the middle of it. Cricket has a shorter fuse than I do, and I needed everyone to stay calm. I told him on a Sunday afternoon about a week into all of this. We sat in his truck in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons, and I laid it all out. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, they were going to leave Gran alone in that house with a broken furnace. Not a question, just a statement. Yes, I said. He stared through the windshield. Okay, he said. What do we need to do? That's cricket. That's always been cricket. The weeks that followed were strange. I kept showing up to Sunday dinners. I kept texting my mother back. I kept doing all the surface level things that a normal daughter does, while underneath I was quietly helping Ms. Weatherby build a legal case and making sure Gran had everything she needed. My mother, during this period, was unusually chatty about Costa Rica. She had done a lot of research, apparently. There was an expat community she'd read about somewhere near the Pacific coast. The cost of living was very reasonable. The weather was perfect. She'd found a condo rental that she described as a fresh start. My father was quieter about it, but every once in a while he'd make a comment about the plan. Like it was a settled thing, like it was already happening. I smiled and asked questions and felt sick every time I got in my car to drive home. One Sunday, about 3 weeks in, my mother mentioned that they were looking at booking flights. Late April, she said. She asked if I wanted to come visit the property in Perth before they wrapped things up there. I said that sounded like a nice idea. She smiled. My father reached for the bread. I excused myself to use the bathroom and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the family photos on the wall. My parents at their wedding. Cricket and me as kids in Halloween costumes. A photo of Gran and my grandfather in the sugar bush, probably 30 years ago. I went back to the table and finished my dinner. The text came on a Wednesday evening. Cricket called about 10 minutes after I got it. I could tell from the way he said my name that he'd gotten one too. Did you see it? He said. I saw it. They actually did it. They tried to, I said. There was a pause. The account? He said. Closed 4 days ago. I heard him exhale. So what happens now? He said. Now Ms. Weatherby makes some calls, I said. And we wait. I'll tell you what happened because you deserve the full picture. My parents landed in Costa Rica. They checked into what I imagine was a very nice resort. And when they tried to pay for the first week using the account they thought they had access to, the transaction was declined. I don't know the exact details of how that moment went. I've imagined it more than once. My father looking at the terminal. My mother checking her phone. The expression on their faces when reality arrived in the form of a politely worded error message. They called me the next morning. My mother's voice was very different from the voice she'd used at Sunday dinner. Tight. Controlled. But I could hear the thing underneath it. She said there was a problem with the account. I said I knew. She said there must have been some kind of mix-up. I said there wasn't. A long silence. Then she said, Rowan, what did you do? And I said, what did you do, Mom? Another silence, longer this time. My father got on the line. He tried a different approach. Practical. Problem-solving. Let's figure out how to fix this. He said they were stranded. They needed funds. They just needed access to tide them over, while they sorted things out from their end. I told him that Ms. Weatherby would be in touch. He said, who? I said, our estate lawyer. The line went very quiet. I said, Gran's furnace has been fixed. She's warm. The trust is being managed properly now. You should probably look into flights home. I hung up. I sat in my apartment for a few minutes after. My cat was on the back of the couch, watching me with the profound indifference that cats specialize in. The spring light was coming through the window. Outside, I could hear someone in the parking lot warming up their car. I texted Cricket. Done. He sent back a single maple leaf emoji, which I thought was very Canadian of him. They came back about a week later. The conversation that followed the actual in-person confrontation happened at Gran's kitchen table, which felt right. Gran was there. Cricket was there. Ms. Weatherby was there by phone. My parents sat across from us, looking like people who had just realized they were in a different kind of conversation than the one they'd prepared for. My father started with the explanation. There were reasons, he said. The costs had been more than expected. The retirement hadn't gone the way they'd planned. They had intended to put it back. My mother went a different direction. She said she felt like we were treating them like criminals. Ms. Weatherby's voice on the phone was calm and precise. She walked through the documentation, the amounts, the dates, the accounts. My mother stopped talking partway through. When it was over, and it took about an hour, my parents sat there looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. Gran had been quiet the whole time. At the end, she looked at my father, her son, and she said, I trusted you because you were family. I won't make that mistake again. She said it gently. That almost made it worse. I want to be honest about what came after, because I think people expect a clean ending and life doesn't really do that. My parents didn't go to Costa Rica again. There were legal consequences, a repayment agreement, conditions, a formal removal from any involvement with the trust. No criminal charges, ultimately, though that was a decision Gran made and we respected it. She said she didn't want to spend her remaining years in courtrooms. I think she also didn't want to see her son arrested. She's a more forgiving person than I am. My relationship with my parents is not what it was, which is maybe accurate to say. It was never what I thought it was. We're not estranged, exactly. We talk. But there's a distance now that wasn't there before, or that was there before, but I could pretend wasn't. You can't unknow what people are capable of. You can decide to keep a relationship anyway, but you have to do it with your eyes open. Cricket and I are closer than ever. That's one thing I didn't expect. That going through something like this would make my brother feel more like family than he already did. But it did. We drive out to Perth about once a month to see Gran. We help with whatever the property needs. In March, Cricket tapped the sugar bush for the first time, the way our grandfather used to, and Gran stood at the kitchen window watching him with an expression I didn't know how to name. Miss Weatherby sent her final invoice and wrote a note at the bottom that said, simply, "Well done, I keep it." I've thought a lot about what I want to say about all of this, because I know it's not just my story. I've met other people, colleagues, friends, strangers who find out what I do for work and suddenly have something they've been carrying. Who have some version of this. A parent who borrowed and didn't pay back. A sibling who helped themselves. A family member who was supposed to be the trustee and wasn't, not really. The thing I keep coming back to is this. The hardest part wasn't discovering what they'd done. It wasn't the legal process or the confrontation, or watching my mother's face when Ms. Weatherby read the numbers out loud. The hardest part was the period in between. The Sunday dinners. The polite texts. The performance of normal while I knew what I knew and they didn't know I knew it. That's the part nobody tells you about. The weeks where you have to keep showing up and smiling, because the alternative is tipping your hand before you're ready. It costs something to do that. I don't know exactly what to call what it cost, but I felt the subtraction. What I know now that I didn't know before is that protecting someone, actually protecting them, not just worrying about them, sometimes means being quiet when everything in you wants to speak. It means building the case before you make the call. It means trusting that the moment will come and being ready when it does. Gran's furnace works perfectly now. The sugar bush is intact. The property will pass, when the time comes, to Cricket and me, the way my grandfather intended. Some things survive. Not everything, and not without cost, but some things. That's enough for now. That's what we have.